All right, guys, so here we are in another episode of From the Coach's Desk, our sort of informal format for communicating to you some more in-depth and important fundamental concepts about strength and conditioning. Today, we want to talk about mesocycles versus macrocycles. And Jake, really what I would like you to do, if you can, is sort of define how we use the terms cycles and phases and where that came from.
So we break it down, and most people have an understanding of this probably without knowing they do. Okay. I think you can say like the traditional term was split, right? What's your split?
Yeah.
We all did it, right? Back in the day, Mondays, chest and back. Tuesdays, maybe legs. Wednesday is going to be shoulders and arms, whatever, right? And then you repeat that process. That's what we essentially call a microcycle.
Yeah.
So a microcycle is a structure that is repeated. It can be...
And it's typically the smallest structure that's repeated in.
I mean, it can be as short as 2 sessions.
Yep.
Or I think some of the longer ones we've done is a 10-day microcycle, which is 2 full weeks. Now, whenever you repeat that structure, you form a mesocycle. And typically what happens, not always, but typically, is some element of progression is applied.
Okay.
We take that structure, we manipulate volume or intensity, and it makes it harder, and so we continue basically to force that supercompensation. And then those microcycles stack together. It can be, in the example of a 10-day microcycle, maybe you go through it twice and it's a mesocycle, 4 weeks long. Yep. You can do it 4 times through, right? And now you're in a 2-month mesocycle. So a mesocycle is simply just microcycles that are stacked together. 2, 3, 4, 5, could be 6 or 7 times. And
they provide a path of progression.
Yes, and so I think that was, in our early days, what we would do is that we would design kind of standalone mesocycles. That was kind of like what we did a lot.
It's almost like we would design the progression.
Yeah.
And then we would be like, okay, we want to do this progression. And then how many times do we want to do it?
Yeah.
And that would be the mesocycle.
And like that would be, but then what would happen is like, we're like, oh, we're going to do work capacity. And we would do a work capacity cycle, it would be great, and then we just totally change gears. And now we'll do strength, or now we'll do stamina, or now we'll do aerobic capacity, right? And I think it got to a point where I was thinking about it, and then I think you took over the programming. I don't think we ever even talked about it, but it was like this idea of just carrying the numbers forward.
Yeah.
And having more of a longer term perspective on training. And I think, we ended up doing Raider cycle, that ended up being, like 5 months altogether, I want to say. It was like we kind of started in the end of summer and went all the way to November. It was only 3 phases, but I believe the phases were like 8 weeks and 6 weeks and something.
Yeah, it was like 9, 7, and 10 or something like that. Yeah, it was.
I think
the total length was like
weeks.
5. Yeah, the total length was like, I think it was 22 weeks. It was like 5. It was like 5.5 months because we counting I think the test weeks in there. Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And so there was this idea of a standalone mesocycle, which can be, a 3-week, 4-week, 5, 6, 8-week program, which would be a good program. But then you're going to shift gears and you're going to go to something else. And most likely, if it's not part of a macrocycle, which is multiple mesocycles, then what's happening is you're kind of just wiping the slate clean. And whatever you did in the previous cycle is not being carried forward. And I think that's one of the kind of the beautiful things about the warrior cycles. Those numbers were always carried forward. And we also had what we talked about was that kind of relationship or that switch of the amount of training time and what we allocated. So like I think 70-30 was kind of a common thing, or maybe 80-20 was where Jordan was starting with, and it'd go 80-20, 70-30, 60-40, 50-50, and it will continue to kind of flip-flop to where you're just dedicating more and more time towards whatever the attribute is you're trying to improve. Maybe it's strength, or maybe it's your conditioning. But the idea that like training should be a much longer term perspective than what most people look at training as.
So to me, one of the coolest things that you're describing is, with the drawback or the limitation of a mesocycle is that, let's say you have a mesocycle where you work strength, right? And you go from like 75 to 95% of your 1RM. Mm-hmm. The great thing about that is you're probably going to see some strength gain in that, right? But the problem is you're only training strength during that time. And then what comes next? Well, if you just go into another mesocycle and that next mesocycle is work capacity or some sort of metabolic development, well, now what are you going to do with all these numbers? And so the limitation of a mesocycle is that you really only get to work one attribute being strength or conditioning, and then you really only get to like work one avenue of it, like neuromuscular strength. What a macrocycle allows you to do is do something like strength endurance, hypertrophy, and then neuromuscular strength. And so now you're building up your volume, inoculating yourself to soreness, and the pure raw numbers of reps into hypertrophy, where now you're not so susceptible to failure from fatigue because of the mesocycle that built your endurance. And so now you start to build a lot of new tissue through your hypertrophy. And then the final mesocycle, you get into your neuromuscular strength, where all this new tissue that you've built, you can now recruit all of that with your central nervous system to produce a transformatively higher 1RM at this point. And this is the big difference between the mesocycle approach that we had when we were younger and the macrocycle approach that we have now that we've been doing this for quite a bit longer.
And I mean, this ties into that, we talked about in one video, the volume dictates the amount of adaptation. And when you stick with, I want to say stick with one theme, but when you have concurrent mesocycles back to back and they're building upon one another, essentially what you're looking at now is a higher volume working a specific thing.
Yes.
And the more volume you spend working that attribute, the better the return on investment is going to be.
The higher the peak.
A 6-month strength cycle is going to work so much better than a 4 to 6 week strength cycle.
You just have to have the discipline to stick with it for that time.
That's the challenge, right?
That really is the challenge.
There's such training should be fun. Right?
It should.
But I think what we talk about, assuming we're not doing this for a profession, right? Military, LEO, whatever.
Different.
But if you're training and you're a civilian, training should be fun. Yep. But the question is the day-to-day grind fun, or is the return on investment on the test day?
That's right.
And seeing the results, is that what makes it fun? I mean, I think it might have been the Raider cycle, and that was the first long cycle that we've done. And a lot of the athletes towards the end of the cycle, they were like, God, I'm just so tired of this. And they were totally fucking over it.
They were over it.
Until test day.
Oh my gosh.
And then, you have guys who are in their, late 30s hitting like lifelong PRs. Yep. You have women being like, oh my God, I've never thought I could move this much weight. And so you saw this big shift of like, people were like, yeah, we're lifting. And then you're like, I'm tired of lifting. This is boring. I don't want to do this anymore. Taper, test. And it's like, holy shit, that was the best
cycle we've ever done.
Yeah. And so I think, when it comes to that perspective of training being fun, you have to ask yourself, are you looking for that like immediate gratification of that one session and how much you enjoyed that 60 minutes of training?
Yep.
Or are you kind of looking more long-term and being like, hey, this is just one piece of 100 pieces that is going to lead to something that's amazing?
And you're, training being fun, training should always be hard. You should just be faster or stronger, right? And so, do you want your floor to always be here, or do you want your floor to actually transform to be here? So whenever you begin that next cycle, you're starting from a higher floor, right? And even if you were to do a completely different type of cycle now your floor doesn't drop all the way back down to here. It just drops to here. So now whenever you get into strength again, you're starting from a higher maintenance point, right?
Yeah.
And so no matter what, you're able to improve. Your ceiling is going to go higher because your floor is higher.
Yep. And that process too, that idea of moving through different phases, and especially when we talk about like having to balance the muscular and metabolic, like the periodization curves.
Yep.
Having one peak and then kind of drop into maintenance and the other one builds and then peaks, is that you have to understand that fitness is not linear.
So true.
It's not like every time you press. Now in high school it is.
Well,
in high school it's great. It's totally linear. But as the more mature the athlete, you're going to see that kind of sine and cosine wave as you move through the training year and the training calendar of like, hey, you're going to hit these peaks and then these troughs. Troughs, is that the right term?
Valleys, you could say, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, the low spot.
Yeah, right.
Trough?
Peak and valley. How about a peak
valley,
and valley?
Peak and valley. To hit that peak, you're going to hit that valley as you go forward. And so it's not like this constant linear, like just up, 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 up. It just doesn't work that way. Even if you're strictly a strength athlete,
that's right.
And even if he was a former endurance athlete, right? He had periods of off season where he was nowhere near as fast as you were when you're competitive cycling,
yep.
Right? And even though you might have been here this year, you had that dip come off season. Next year you're up here.
Yes.
Right. So you have to understand, especially if you start looking at this from multi-year perspectives. The goal would be to have the peak here, then you have the valley, and then the next peak is higher. Yep. And the valley is a little higher than the previous one, and it continues to work uphill.
Because all training is cumulative,
Yep.
right? And volume is king. Volume determines how much of the adaptation you get. And bottom line, you got to keep training.
Yep. Okay, that's I guess that was, what was the summation of that? That was meso.
That's mesocycles versus macrocycles, and our sort of evolution with it, and the big benefits of macrocycles.